video for the blog that really just went over just the common information about what watercolor paper is, the different types and the different weights, and how to choose which one you want to work with. Now in the classes on gelatos and twinkling H2Os and several others, I go over and we demonstrate what each product looks like on watercolor paper. So we won't be doing that here. This is more general, just some basic information about watercolor paper, because it's a question that comes up in many of my classrooms. So first of all, watercolor paper comes in basically 3 different types, and that has to do with its smoothness and then a number of different weights. We're going to talk first about the different surfaces of watercolor paper. And before I get to that, I just want to talk briefly about, how does watercolor paper differ from cardstock or canvas? Watercolor paper is designed specifically to have water added to it. It allows the colorant on your watercolor pencils or gelatos to stay on the top of the paper while the water dries. So all the color isn't absorbed into the paper. So if you use them on cardstock, which is fine, your colors just won't be quite as vibrant as they would be on watercolor paper. Also, generally speaking, cardstock is not as heavy a weight as many of the watercolor papers that are out there, so you're going to be more prone towards it warping. And because it's not treated properly to handle the water, you'll run into more issues of the paper pilling or tearing, or basically just degrading because you've put water on it. So if you're going to be working with watercolor pencils or any other water activated coloring tool, I encourage you to use watercolor paper. Now, watercolor paper can be expensive, so you want to know what you're purchasing before you buy it. So it comes in basically three different surfaces. You have what's called cold pressed watercolor paper. This is the most common, and it is the most used by beginners and advanced alike. It has a slight texture to it, which I'm sure you cannot see in the video. Let's see, this one has a little bit stronger texture. You might be able to see that. Anyway, it's kind of bumpy. I say it's for me to remember which is which, the difference between cold and hot, and let's talk about hot for a moment. Hot pressed water paper is smooth. There's no grain to it. So the way I tell the difference is if I was cold, I would have goosebumps. So that reminds me that cold has texture to it and hot does not. Now pressed watercolor paper, which is also known as HP watercolor paper, is generally used for fine details. So if you want to use a mix of your watercolors plus pens or pencils, this is a great surface to use. I also think it works really good with rubber stamping because the texture on a cold pressed watercolor paper sometimes means your image doesn't stamp as clearly as you would like. So my favorite to use if I'm going to use stamps is hot pressed. If I'm going to do a color wash or use stencils or something along that line, then I'm more apt to choose cold press because I kind of like the texture of it. Now, from company to company, the texture of your watercolor paper, how big it'll be, there's really a lot of variations. So you should check them out and decide which one you like the best. There is a third one called rough, which has a lot of texture to it. Generally speaking, for a watercolorist, that one is the most advanced because it allows the longest period of drying time because of the texture. So it allows the painter to really have some time to work with his colors before they dry. Obviously, then hot pressed dries the fastest because it is smooth, and cold pressed falls someplace in the middle. I don't own any rough, because I'm not a watercolorist, I'm not painting paintings. So that's not really necessary for me to have. It's also not necessarily necessary for me to have a large size of watercolor paper either. The standard sizes work just fine for me. So let's also talk just a little bit about the weight of watercolor paper. Typically, the most common weight is 140 pounds, but you can go all the way down to 90-pound paper, which is actually quite thin. Now I have some, you'll notice it was clearance out, I got a good deal on it. I do not use this, generally speaking, for a final product. I use this instead for creating, or to play, to work, to figure things out. When I'm testing things, it's a really good paper to use for that. The reason you don't want to use it for your final product is it tends to warp really easily, so it's just not a high enough grade for a finished card or a finished product. But it's great if you're testing things out and just want to see how a new tool works. As I said, the 140 pound is the most common and used by most people. You can go all the way up to 300 pounds. 300 pound is pretty expensive for the general crafter. The benefit for it, if you were a watercolor artist, is that you're less likely to have to stretch your paper. Any paper, really. Once you get it wet, the fibers are going to loosen up and it's going to warp a little bit. And then as it dries, it may or may not dry flat. So most watercolorists will do what's called stretching their paper, which just means that they get it slightly wet and then they tape it down to a board, a board similar to what's on the back of a paper pad, something thick and sturdy that's not going to warp. And then they tape it down and then they let it dry flat. And as it dries, the fibers are going to contract, but then when you go back to add color to it, the paper won't warp. Now, if I were creating a painting, that is what I would do. But since I generally just work on cards and some scrapbook items, maybe a little something for the house, nothing really elaborate, I do not stretch my paper. So even 140 pound is going to warp just a little bit, but a lot less than the 90, obviously. But because I'm using such a small amount of paper, it generally works fine. I don't have to worry about stretching it. But you can if you want to make sure that it is perfectly flat. So that's the weight. Let's see how it's sold. Generally, watercolor paper is sold in about 4 different ways. One, you can have just loose sheets of it. You can buy it spiral bound, which is what you would find in most craft stores. You can also buy it in much larger sheets that come in rolls. My favorite way is to buy it in these blocks, which is what you see here. And the blocks will be glued on all 4 corners. So that really helps to kind of keep it from warping, because it's similar to having it on a board. So that really, again, it kind of limits some of the warping. Of course, for me, because I'm using just a small amount, I may take the sheet out before I start working on it. Just depends on how I want to do it for that time. So after you get done coloring, you simply separate the sheet out and pull it away from the pad. Now, these are harder to find in a typical craft store. I buy mine on Dick Blick. They're really good price there. So I have both hot press and cold press. Like I said, I tend to use hot press when I am coloring in a stamped image, because I want that stamped image to be a really clear image. And obviously, if you want to use watercolor paper as your entire front of your card and you want to stamp a sentiment on it, then definitely you want to use hot press. I use cold press for other projects where I'm not going to have a stamped image, or I don't have a stamped image where I care about the fine details. So this works better for me, like I said, when I'm doing a background wash or a collage piece, or I'm using stencils. So that's basically the basic information about watercolor paper, the differences, and the surface type, and the weight, and what's the best for the project that you might be completing. If you have any questions about any of this information, please be sure to let me know.